Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our discussion of the United States and the Cold War. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, by early 1950, a cascade of events had sent his popularity numbers spiraling and seemed to indicate that the United States was on the verge of losing the Cold War. And so in January 1950, Truman ordered a sweeping review of American foreign policy in the Cold War. The lead author of the resulting report was Paul Nitze, who was Deputy Director of the State Department Policy Planning Staff under Director George Kennan. The resulting document was known as NSC-68, National Security Council Document 68. It is one of the most important and infamous documents of the Cold War. And so in this lecture, we discuss this document, NSC-68. Nitze's background likely influenced the overall tone and intentions of the report. Nitze was a Harvard graduate who had started his career on Wall Street, where he survived the worst of the stock market crash and depression. After a decade or more of successful investing, Nitze migrated into government service during World War II, where he remained for the rest of his career. Among his wartime tasks was to assess the damage done by the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. While devastating, in Nitze's view, the bombs did not imply the end of the world. Nitze witnessed the Japanese immediately beginning recovery efforts, saw that those who had been able to shelter during the bombing survived, and that outside of the total destruction in the relatively small Ground Zero area, the cities were able to resume normal life fairly quickly. Of course, the longer-term effects of radiation poisoning were not fully understood, but Nitze's takeaway from the experience was that a nuclear war was survivable, and therefore nuclear weapons were as valid a military option as anything else. Nitze also worked in Europe during the recovery effort, distributing aid under the Marshall Plan. He saw Europeans terrified of Soviet expansion and the Red Army, and generally agreed with Kennan's rather grim assessments in the Long Telegram and the X article. Not long after that experience, he was working under Kennan and soon replacing him as the lead author on Truman's requested analysis of the Cold War. Kennan, while frustrated at not being involved in the details of the project, was also nearing retirement and wanted to transition to a late career shift as a scholar. Thus, it was Nitze whose voice was most prominent in NSC-68. Nitze was both less subtle than Kennan and less skilled as a writer. The final report was not artfully written and was quite blunt. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who had appointed Nitze as the lead, wrote, "The purpose of NSC-68 was to so bludgeon the mass mind of top government that not only could the president make a decision, but that the decision could be carried out. The task of a public officer seeking to explain and gain support for a major policy is not that of the writer of a doctoral thesis." The report was presented in two major chunks: an assessment of the state of things in the Cold War at that time, and policy recommendations based on the realities presented in the first part. When writing about the state of things, NSC-68 more or less reinforced and affirmed much of what we believed up to that time. It argued that the United States and the Soviet Union were polarized as great powers. This was an us against them situation. Thus, it advocated continuing to hold a hard line on communism and not negotiating or compromising in any way. It also argued, as Kennan had done, that the Soviets controlled communism all around the globe, and thus that any communist movement anywhere was taking its marching orders from Moscow. This becomes a very controversial belief when we start thinking about communism rising in places like Cuba or Korea or Vietnam? Were the Soviets really dictating all of those developments? It also argued, as Kennan had done, that the Soviet Union was bent on world domination, that it was determined to conquer the world, as the document stated in part. In the minds of the Soviet leaders, achievement of this design requires the dynamic extension of their authority and the ultimate elimination of any effective opposition to their authority. To that end, Soviet efforts are now directed toward the domination of the Eurasian landmass. As I'll discuss shortly, not everyone agreed with that assessment, but that's what was argued in NSC-68. In describing technology, NSC-68 argued that the United States was in a superior position in terms of technology. We had more weapons and better weapons than the Soviets at that time. But the response, of course, is not to rest on our laurels and be confident in our superior technology, but rather that we must continue building more and improving and building more and more powerful weapons in order to stay ahead. If we pause for even a moment, the Soviets would assuredly catch us and pass us in terms of both the quality and the amount of weapons. So what should our policies be in response to these realities? What should the United States do? Well, NSC-68, of course, is limited in its ability to advocate for certain policies, but that's what the National Security Council was created to do. And so they argued that the United States should not bother negotiating with the Soviets, as it was virtually certain the United States would be unable to change their policies. If we ever did negotiate, it should only be to turn the Soviets down and turn them away, and thus express our superior position. As noted, we needed to continue developing bigger and stronger and more powerful weapons, notably the hydrogen bomb, the H-bomb, to stay ahead of the Soviets in the weapons race. Our posture should not be all defensive moving forward. This is a major turning point coming out of NSC-68. Containment is a defensive posture. You are waiting for the enemy to show where it's trying to spread, and then you go there to stop it and contain it. NSC-68 was saying containment was not good enough. We shouldn't only contain communism where it appeared to be spreading. We needed to look for weaknesses and probe for weaknesses going forward and push back aggressively against communism. Again, there are those who look at moments like this and practices like this and point the finger more at the United States as the aggressor during the Cold War. We could certainly see kind of holding up the mirror from one side to the other that we're saying almost the same things from opposite sides. NSC-68 also argued for increasing American strength. Not only military strength, but strength in every way, political strength, economic strength, and so on. Continue to expand and improve the conventional military to be effective in case there was a non-atomic conflict that broke out. NITSE and NSC-68 notably avoided much direct discussion of how much any of this would cost, but it did suggest that we would need to increase taxes to pay for these developments. It also called for the launching of a publicity and propaganda campaign to secure consensus in the country. And again, as we'll note going forward, this in part might play a role in the growing Red Scare in the following years. It also called for establishing and maintaining a strong alliance system with the United States at the center, and that the Americans should attempt to win over the Soviet people so that they might undermine the Soviet proletariat from within. Now, how exactly we were going to do this was left unsaid, but I would note that over the future years there was a growing cultural campaign that did involve trying to reach across the so-called Iron Curtain and reach the Soviet people directly. It's difficult to overstate the importance of this document in that moment in 1950. Here we are 5 years into the Cold War, and Harry Truman and his advisors receives this document, NSC-68, that both reinforces what we thought we believed and then called for these new policies and new developments going forward. Truman absorbed it. Many others in his administration accepted it either in full or at least important parts of it. As we will note, many scholars in hindsight, and some people at that time, suggested that NSC-68 was grounded on a number of faulty assumptions about the state of the world and about the state of the growing conflict with the Soviets. And because it was grounded on faulty assumptions, the policies that it called for, and which ultimately came to be, were faulty in themselves. There are many scholars who look back at NSC-68 as a key turning point moment in the Cold War. So what are some of the shortcomings or failings of NSC-68? Well, it suggested that global politics was a zero-sum game. That is, there is a finite amount of territory on the planet, and if communism gained an inch anywhere, that the United States lost an inch. This suggests that every bit of territory on the globe is equally important, that East and West Berlin are just as important as Cuba or Korea or Vietnam or Africa or Latin America. And so the result coming out of NSC-68 is that the United States will view every conflict anywhere on the planet as important. And what we'll see going forward, and particularly during the Eisenhower years, is these areas that we describe as the periphery of the Cold War, not necessarily the direct conflict between the United States and Soviets, but other regions become really the core area of conflict in the Cold War. Critics also say NSC-68 misinterpreted Soviet intentions. It was never really the Soviet goal to conquer the world or take over the world. Even if aspirationally, Soviet leaders believed that communism would be ideal if it was a global system, that didn't mean they were saying, we, the Soviet Union, are going to conquer the globe. It also overestimated Soviet influence and control, both within the satellite states and potentially as it was reaching out to other areas of the globe. And we'll discuss this much further when we talk about conflicts in places like Korea and Vietnam and Cuba and elsewhere. And finally, the fact that NSC-68 dismissed negotiation, dismissed compromise as a tactic going forward. Many view this as kind of a lost opportunity. There are many Cold War scholars who look back on those early years of the Cold War and believe if there had just been more openness, more discussion, more negotiation, that things might have turned out very differently. Here are some of the words of one of the critics of NSC-68, Georgy Kornienko, who served in the foreign ministry of the Soviet Union for almost the duration of the Cold War, from 1949 to 1990. Kornienko wrote, "From my perspective, the author's fundamental premises, theoretical and factual, were incorrect. And hence, so is the essence of their recommendations, which laid the groundwork for a more confrontational Soviet-American relationship in the post-war period than was objectively necessary." He continued, "The fundamental conceptual flaw of NSC-68, to my mind, consists in the fact that its authors, consciously or not, equated the Soviet government's declared confidence in the victory of communism around the world with an imaginary aspiration of the Soviet Union as a state to establish its absolute power over the rest of the world." Kornienko concludes, NSC-68 played a profoundly negative role in post-war history. So, did NSC-68 exaggerate the Soviet threat? Well, Truman's popularity, as I've noted, was approaching an all-time low. The Soviet Union was relatively quiet and didn't appear as the threat depicted in NSC-68. But when North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, with NSC-68 in all likelihood still sitting on Truman's desk, it seemed that NSC-68 had it right on the money. As Dean Acheson said later, Korea came along and saved us. It is to that conflict, the Korean War, that I'll turn in my next lecture.